Port Royal wasn't the first time Pintel had plotted an escape from the British Navy. He couldn't even remember how many years ago the first time had been. Enough that Ragetti had only barely been the taller of the two of them. The youngster had truly still been a youngster back then, and neither of them had been a pirate yet. They hadn't been prisoners of the Navy back then either, at least not in the traditional sense of the word. They had been soldiers. The memory of it all still twisted Pintel's face in ghoulish ways. If two hapless drunks who'd been nabbed off the street and forced into service could be called recruits, then any man who was Catholic and bossy could be called a priest. One bad night at his favorite tavern in Kingston had turned into a year-long nightmare aboard a naval vessel, and poor Rags had been dragged through every second of it with him. Endless training and labor. Moldy, worm-riddled food. A list of rules twice the length of his arm, and 10 times as many excuses to beat anyone who didn't follow them perfectly. No bleeding wonder the fleet had to resort to Crown-sanctioned kidnapping to fill its ranks. Those things had done a number on Pintel, and he had the scars to prove it, including a wicked-looking one on his brow that he'd gotten from glancing over his shoulder during a flogging, but he'd stayed Pintel through it all. Ragetti hadn't stayed Ragetti. In that single year, the cheerful, chatty, sharp-witted lad that Pintel had known in Kingston had withered into an ambling mute with a bottomless, empty stare. A human-shaped husk that simply took up space until its next beating. A glorified training dummy. It had taken Pintel longer than he liked admitting to notice that change, but once he had, that had been the end of it. Within a week, he'd formed a plan, and at the first chance, he'd volunteered himself and Ragetti for the much-hated overnight watch duty on deck. Their officers had accepted the offer, not knowing who they were dealing with, and as soon as that whole red and blue-coated crew had settled into the belly of the vessel to sleep, he and Rags had jumped ship in a stolen longboat. That seemed to be their signature move now. Why had he done that for Ragetti? And why had he kept the kid by his side for all the years since then and escaped both of them again from Port Royal? Pintel usually tried explaining it away to himself with logic. He needed a sidekick to watch his back whenever he ran into trouble, a younger and faster assistant to do all his legwork for him, a patsy to blame his mistakes on who wouldn't earn as much ire from their superiors. And maybe, once upon a time, someone to take out his frustrations on, so he wouldn't fire his mouth or his fists at any of those superiors instead. Deep down, though, he'd always known the real reason why he kept Rags close and out of too much trouble. Because he knew she would have wanted him to. Edith, Pintel's younger sister. Edith Ragetti. Pintel had never met her husband, Giuseppe Ragetti. Probably Catholic. Edith had spoken highly of him, of course, but Giuseppe had been a merchant sailor. That line of work meant spending months at a time out at sea, and only coming home with earnings remotely worth that toil half of the time. The businessman in Pintel had always frowned on that, especially when he'd learned what sort of work Edith had taken up to support herself and their son in the meantime. Whenever he recalled that embarrassing diversion that Bosun had ordered him and Rags to put on for the Navy at Isla de Muerta just before their arrest, dressed in those frilly gowns with Ragetti twirling his parasol and yoo-hooing at the soldiers with a wave of his fan, Pintel wondered if the lad had learned any of those tricks from the days when Edith had been forced to bring her son to that brothel with her. Pintel had sent his sister money when he could. He'd even moved his consignment shop to the port of Kingston to be closer to her once the funds to do so had been in place. And when the worst had happened, when Giuseppe's ship had sailed in without him one day and only given his last wages and a half-hearted condolence to his widow, Pintel had moved in with her, and with her 10-year-old son, Terrence. Pintel had called him Terry for short. Terry Rags, like the pieces of cloth you would use to wipe down a bar or a countertop. And he'd let the kid call him Uncle Abner despite how old it made him feel. The little squirt had apparently taken after Giuseppe when it came to his build, being scrawny and all limbs instead of short and sturdy like his mother, but he'd gotten Edith's dark blonde hair and blue eyes. He'd also gotten her charm. It had been impossible to look at him, quietly eating one of his favorite mangoes out there on her porch with his polite smiles and sly, knowing glances, and not be at least a bit fond of him. His uncle had been a bit fond of him, but only a bit. There had always been a part of Pintel that saw Ragetti as a financial burden that Giuseppe had left on Edith, although the kid could hardly be blamed for that. And it was clear enough that the little string bean meant no harm. Rags had also more than pulled his weight while working in Pintel's shop for a number of years, a prelude to all of the lad's future heavy lifting and legwork on his uncle's behalf. That bit of fondness was why, many more years after their first meeting, the two had found themselves stumbling together out of that tavern on the fateful night that they had joined the Navy. Neither of them had seen Edith since then. They couldn't. Deserting the service was grounds for hanging, and the home of their last surviving relative was surely the first place the authorities would think to look for the pair. Abner Pintel and Terry Ragetti were criminals for life, and so they'd grudgingly embraced it by becoming full-fledged pirates. In for a penny, in for a pound, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. At least those red-coated bilge rats were sorry for recruiting them now. Pintel couldn't bear to think of his sister anymore. Not about where she'd had to turn for money in his absence, or if she was even still alive, or if there'd ever been any way to help her without putting her son at risk. Nothing but anguish and rage came from those thoughts, so the pirate had done everything he could to keep her memory locked away, and his eyes locked on his next so-called business venture. And he hadn't let Ragetti call him Uncle anything since the night they jumped ship. Every one of those recollections ate away at the older sea rat like a sack full of maggots, even as he put Port Royal farther and farther behind him now with each stroke of the oars. Maybe he hadn't stayed Pintel after all. The pair rowed together all through the night and most of the following morning. That was when they decided to start taking turns rowing. Tortuga was at least another day from their current position, but Pintel knew of a small island along the way where he and Ragetti could make camp the next night. The trick would be to row the most direct course to that island, and, confident in his ability to do that, the older sailor had taken the first turn with the oars. This, unfortunately, left his one-eyed boatmate sitting with idle hands and even more idle thoughts. "Not more wind," Ragetti cringed. Pintel squinted up at him through the afternoon sunlight. "What's wrong with that? It makes rowing a lot easier." "But I can feel every hair on me head moving with it. It's like I've got an ant colony crawling around up there." "You just ain't used to feeling things like that again now that the curse is lifted. It's fine." Even as he said that, Pintel couldn't help twitching at the tickle of the breeze on the back of his neck. It actually made him glad that he didn't have nearly as many hairs on his head to feel rustling around. Ragetti grabbed his own scalp and bent over. As soon as that Navy uniform went taut over his shoulder blades, he grunted and jolted upright. "Gah! Blimey! I can feel me clothes rubbing all over me every time I moves." "Oh, quit your whining," Pintel snapped. "You're gonna make those things start bothering me, too." "I can't help it," Ragetti said with a glance at the prison dog. "We didn't have none of this to deal with in jail." "Oi, you wanna go back? You'll be swimming if you does." "No," Ragetti muttered. He suddenly spasmed again. "Ew! Oh, jeez!" "Now what?" "There's sweat drops running down me front." The lanky man started rubbing his white uniform shirt against his chest like a wash rag. "Oh, bloody hell, it's all this heat from being out in the sun. We's getting cooked alive. How's the top of your head not burning from this?" "I said, don't make those things start bothering me too," Pintel bellowed. He felt a sweat drop roll down his right temple as if on cue. Ragetti snaked one arm under his shirt to mop the sweat with his fingers. It only took him a few seconds to get fed up with that and begin tugging at the outsides of his clothes. Off came the crisscrossing bandoliers. Off came the red coat. He got halfway through undoing all the buttons on the shirt when he started trying to yank the whole thing off over his head. Pintel shrank back like the younger man had just aimed a pistol at him. What are you doing?" "I can't take it no more," Ragetti's muffled voice griped from somewhere in the shirt. "This suit's too hot. Must be made of wool or something." "Keep your clothes on." "We're in the middle of nowhere. Who's gonna see me?" "I am." No sooner did the shirt come off than Ragetti fell from his bench with a shriek. The dog barked in alarm. Pintel was nearly panicking too by then. "What?" he yelped.
What is it?
"A sweat drop just ran down me bum crack." Before his elder could even scoff, Ragetti was doubled over on his feet and struggling with his waistband.
Oi, keep your britches on!
Pintel exclaimed over more of the dog's barking.
You're rocking the boat!
Ragetti's bony fingers tugged the waistband down. Pintel squawked in revulsion and pulled in one of the oars. He gripped the other in both hands and furiously swung it forward.
Don't hit him!
He yelled in his head. He jerked the oar back just in time. The stocky fellow teetered in his own seat for a moment, then he set the offending instrument in his lap and picked up the first other weapon he saw. The dog. Ragetti plopped back onto his bench as the hairy buffer was shoved into his arms. Pintel sneered as he took up the oars again.
Jesus H. Christ.
He stopped. So did Ragetti. The two fumed at one another, each daring the other to start the next round. Ragetti looked about ready to do those honors when the dog abruptly dropped its keys into his lap. He stared down at the iron trinkets in surprise. Then, like magic, all the anger slid from his face and made way for a more somber expression. Even Pintel could tell he was remembering Bosun and that last redcoat again. Ragetti handed the keys back to the dog with resignation and wiped his sweaty hands on its fur. Something snide was on the tip of Pintel's tongue, but he left it there. Instead, he wiped the sweat from his brow, wincing at how hot his head felt, and snatched the lieutenant's tricorner hat from the floor of the boat. He jammed it grudgingly onto his head and used the shade from it to help scan his surroundings. It was like seeing with new eyes. In place of all the blinding brightness, he now could make out lapping sapphire waves and a pale, cloud-speckled sky over every horizon. And along the horizon to his left, he spied a white stripe of sand, with the tall, slanted trunks and feathery fronds of more than a dozen palm trees rising from it. He must have rowed a more direct course than he'd realized. Pintel gleefully started bringing the longboat around.
Glory hallelujah.